So I'm introducing Catherine Shaner, who's now assistant professor of New Testament at Wake Forest Divinity School of Divinity, and a position that she took over last year. Her research interests include constructions of race, class, and gender in the New Testament, household religions in the ancient Mediterranean, and feminist womanist hermeneutics. She's currently working on a book, which is actually the result of the dissertation she wrote and discussed and defended here at HTS about slavery in early Christianity using archaeological, literary, and epigraphic materials located in and around the city of Ephesus. Thanks, Kat.
It's wonderful to be on this end of the microphone here in this very room. I've spent much time on that end. First and foremost, I want to thank Dean Hempton, Giovanni, for the invitation to come and for others who made it possible. Professor Wright, congratulations on the culmination of many years. In fact, a lifetime of study. I love the image of you and your sister as small children rushing to the bedroom to read Philemon. My students at Wake Forest University School of Divinity were starstruck when they heard about this event. One even asked to be smuggled in my suitcase. Your work has indeed been very influential, and I will rely on Giovanni's praise, which was so well delivered. And given the afternoon hour, we'll jump right in. One of the strengths of this work is the fact that you insist on understanding both the historical and theological modes of interpretation as necessary for fully grasping Paul's thought. You write at one point that the particularities of the historical situation connect the dots between theology and history, a point that you show with many, many particularities of historical situation throughout the book. This connection puts you in an interesting position in terms of interlocutors. Evangelical contexts in the United States in particular have tended to look at historical critical studies of Paul with much suspicion, as a project that denies the plain meaning of the text for contemporary individual believers. On the other side of the equation, some academic circles eschew theological inquiry as doctrinaire and confessional. Indeed, in the historical turn in religious studies and to some extent theological education has been disconcerting and alienating to some in more conservative and even US mainline denominations. I confess here only a cursory knowledge of UK religious landscape and only through experience among Anglo-Catholic Episcopal communities here in the US. Your goal, however, is to find a middle ground, to put theology and history into relationship with each other for the sake of better understanding Paul, the great apostle. You do this through a category you work out called Paul's worldview, and you've spoke about this in your lecture this afternoon. You write, quote, "By studying Paul within worldview categories, we acquire a new way of seeing not only what was really important within his full-blown theology, but also why theology as a whole has become important for him. This category of worldview is a combination of symbol, narrative, and praxis, culture, and worship, Paul's everyday life, built on his theological commitments." While the political is decidedly missing from this definition early in the book, later you draw it in as you detail Roman imperial influences. You're very cautious and careful to distance Paul, and with Paul your interpretive stance, from involvement in the political, particularly the imperial political world. Paul, you argue, was neither the great subversive anti-imperialist, nor was he unaware of Roman reach and influence. He inhabited a middle ground. Certainly, your sharp critique of those who paint Paul as an anti-imperial hero is, in fact, well taken. At the same time, I wonder if you have dismissed too quickly some of the feminist contributions that might be had to your work. Your corrective methodological framing around the relationship between historical studies of Paul and theological studies of Paul as necessary integrated is one that is welcomed. As much fun as a rousing discussion of first century history would be, my questions, however, arise not from the need to separate history from theology In fact, feminist interpreters, and this is where I think they could be helpful for you, have been insisting that such a project is impossible and undesirable for decades now. So rather, my question comes in the framing of historical studies and theological studies apart from structures of power, both in the first century and in the current one. Feminists' early insistence that all theological and historical biblical study is inherently political, both for its power to liberate, edify, and unify, and in its power to exclude, marginalize, and oppress. In fact, the dichotomy between liberation, oppression, unifying, and marginalizing, here that dichotomy doesn't really help. Interpreting Paul or any other biblical text is a messy business, as we all well know. Particularly in the argument that Paul's theological perspective, or perhaps transformation, informs, permeates, and signifies in his everyday life, the question of ethics of interpretation arises. How do we understand not only Paul's theological world, but what are the power implications for the way that world is constructed? So in correcting others' corrective lenses, how much do Paul's own lenses assume a certain power dynamic? And to what end is that ethic? Particularly for contemporary churches. So I want to frame this with two examples. One Giovanni has already mentioned. Sometimes you translate the word Christos as king and sometimes as Messiah, both of which you argue are political terms in keeping with Jewish expectations of a political Messiah, who then paradoxically found his way to the cross. Is there any room in the Pauline tradition to critique kingship and sovereignty Christologies and imperial victory theologies? If Paul is indeed completely transformed by his Damascus Road experience, why does the Christ image in that transformation tend to look like the victorious emperor, the not Augustus, or the beloved king, depending on whether you read Augustus or David as an allusion in Messiah language? Particularly when these images, theologies, worldviews that imagine that particularly when images, theologies, and worldviews that imagine egalitarian ethos do in fact exist in the first century. I think Galatians 3:28, Acts 2, Paul's own clothed in Christ illustration. Another example where an analysis of power dynamics as part of Paul's worldview comes is in your interpretation of Philemon. As someone who works on slavery and early Christianity, of course, Philemon is a key text. I found it fascinating that you framed the whole volume with this tiniest of books. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, so why is this in the canon anyway? From students, from colleagues, from churchgoers alike. Your reading gave me much to savor in contemplating that fresh question in a new way. Of course, the difficulty of this text is precisely the methodological problem you flag. The rhetorical situation in the text, its historical content, even theological allusions, all need to be drawn from seemingly vague references and exceedingly brief bits about the lives at stake in the text. For historical interpreters, the hundreds of different historical judgments needed in order to interpret the letter begin to swirl around until the decisions outnumber the words of the text. Some of these decisions you've shown us. Is Onesimus a brother or a slave? Is Onesimus a runaway or a slave who has run on the wrong side of his master? Is Paul returning a runaway and begging for mercy, or is Paul appealing as an amicus domini with a comparison that Pliny's letter would suggest? There's also Albert Harrell's theory that Onesimus is in fact an apprentice to Paul. Ephesus or Rome? Where was it written? Where was Paul staying? Where was Paul imprisoned? Does Paul advocate manumission or obedience? Does Paul want Onesimus to stay with Philemon or make the trip back to work with him? Some of your historical decisions you have outlined, and rightly so. There are, of course, many others. Is Philemon Onesimus' owner, or Archippus, or Apphia? For theological interpreters looking for classic signs of Christology, eschatology, and even ecclesiology, the letter falls far short. Seeing the connections between the historical decisions one needs to make and the theological implications is, however, a significant contribution to the scholarly discussion. For example, the line in Philemon 15 of Philemon having Onesimus back forever, being connected with Levitical laws on slavery and jubilee, was incredibly fascinating to me. I hadn't made that connection. Yet it strikes me that along with Lloyd Lewis, that Paul discusses another human being's fate with Philemon without any sense that Onesimus could intervene. In other words, Onesimus is an object in the discussion, not a person. Now, I'm not naive, and I have read your introduction, so I know your objection to some of these questions of Paul's ethics. We can't expect Paul to have our ethics, nor to be an abolitionist, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. But in any framework in which we read the text, the power differential between Onesimus, Philemon, and Paul nearly always puts Paul on top. That means that Paul's worldview cannot take into account the totalizing power that both he and Philemon hold over Onesimus as a slave. Onesimus has no way to break against that totalizing power, a totalizing power that Paul ascribes to Christ as Lord elsewhere in his correspondence. Even if this power is wielded for the sake of reconciliation, Paul, as the broker of that reconciliation, is still more powerful, and that we cannot ignore. Given that Paul's worldview does so strongly articulate in other places an ethic of egalitarian sensibility in Christ, and once again I flag Galatians 3:28, 1 Corinthians 12:13, in addition to the power of God's faithfulness, what resources might we draw upon to account for the very real power dynamics that were present both in the historical situations in which Paul wrote to churches throughout the Mediterranean and in the theological underpinnings of his messages? Once again, I thank you for the opportunity to interact with your work and with you in this forum. Thank you, Professor Wright.